Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching Using Auto Deploy for ESXi deployment. So let's talk a little bit about Auto Deploy. Auto Deploy allows you to have stateless ESXi hosts. Basically, you don't have to have any storage, internal or external, like boot from SAN. The hosts boot up, your servers, your blades, whatever, they boot up, and they grab an image using PXE. So PXE allows them to boot up, DHCP and IP address, and get an address for a TFTP server, pull an image down, boot up, and connect into vCenter. Configuration of the host is handled by host profiles and answer files. We've covered those in another lesson. One thing you'll learn about auto deploy is there's a lot of pieces and parts. So we're going to pull some things in from the image builder lesson, pull things in from the host profile lesson, things like that, and put this together to make all this work. Some requirements. First, you have to have some PXE infrastructure, mainly DHCP and TFTP. So DHCP is going to hand out addresses. Even if you do static reservations, which I recommend, you still need DHCP. And you also need to be able to configure the DHCP because we have to add what are called two options. We'll go over those in a minute, but you need to be able to do that. And TFTP is just a way to grab a file without having to authenticate or log in. If you don't have a TFTP server, SolarWinds has a very good free one. That's what I'll be using in the lab. You need to have VMware vSphere Power CLI 5.0 because there is some work we have to do in Power CLI. The ESXi install image from the image builder CLI, so we'll go back to that lesson as well. vCenter Server 5.0 or newer. And vSphere Enterprise Plus licensing because you also need host profiles. So you got to add all that stuff together to get what you need. It does require some Power CLI work. Not always as easy as I'd like it. It's not bad. I'll walk you through the commands. We basically just say, I want to use that ESXi image, and then we set up what are called some claim rules. So it's not terrible. And there is a kind of a graphical interface to this that someone developed. I believe it's a VMware Fling, as they call it, which is kind of an unsupported tool to kind of walk you through this through more of a UI. But the Power CLI is not bad. What you'll find about this is just that there's a lot of parts to it, so we'll walk through the steps in the lab. Couple diagram of the components. So basically the way this works is you have some hosts, obviously. They boot up. They go and talk to the auto deploy engine, which has a few things. We have a rules engine, which decides which image profile, which extra ESXi VIBs and drivers, which OEM VIBs, anything like that that we need to add. And so basically it boots up, talks to what we call the waiter. The waiter gets all the information from the rules engine, and the waiter then turns around and hands the stuff back to the server. Once the server boots up, it's configured using a host profile and an answer file. The nice thing is, once you do all this once it puts all these pieces and parts together once, it has an image profile and host profile cache. So it's not exactly slow the first time, but it does cache its information for the second and third times that you boot. But the pieces to understand, you do need host profiles. You will need an image profile. If you need any special VIBs or drivers, you got to put those in your image. And we do have to create rules for the rules engine. Before you install the auto deploy server, you need to do a few other things. One, I just mentioned this TFTP server. Several free options. Again, I use SolarWinds. It's easy and it works well. You need to add some DHCP server custom options. So for the scope, for the subnet that you're going to use for this, you need to add option 66 and 67. 66 is boot server. You set the IP of your TFTP server. So you'll set option 66 and the IP of whatever is running that SolarWinds TFTP server. Then option 67 is the file name that's actually going to grab. And the name is right there. It's an odd name. I don't know why they named it that, but that's what it is. And we'll see that here in a minute. But it's obviously everything without the parentheses. So option 66 will be set to an IP. 67 will be set to this name. I use the Windows DHCP here in this lab. I don't normally. The reason I say that is not all DHCP servers allow you to set options. So, if you're using your, internet provider's router box, a lot of those don't let you do it. That's one reason I no longer use one of those. But I use an application called Untangle, which does allow you to I use an application called Untangle, which does allow you to set those things, but it's not really clean and easy like I like. So for the lab, I'll be using Microsoft's. And Microsoft's DHCP server lets you set these no problem. They're all built in. You just punch in the IP, punch in the boot file name, and you're good to go. Overall steps: prep the Pixie environment, easy enough. Install the auto deploy server onto a Windows system. You can install it on the vSphere or vCenter host. That's what I've done. And it's also already installed on the vCenter server appliance that runs Linux. You'll need to copy a gpixie boot image to the TFTP server. That's the file that we just plugged into our DHCP options. And I'll show you how to get the file, and you'll just unzip it, and there's a bunch of stuff in there that you just drop in the root of your TFTP server. You'll create what we call auto deploy rules. These rules do a couple of things. First of all, it says which image to hand to host. They'll tell it which cluster to join once they've booted up, and then which host profile to assign to a new system. We'll set these. They're fairly easy. The only thing is you have to figure out how you define or apply the rules. When I do it in the lab, I'll do it by IP address. If you see an IP from this range, use these rules. But you can do it by vendor, serial number, OEM strings. You can do it by all kind of things. But it's pretty common to see it done by IP. And that string is called a pattern. What do I look for? Because you may have one image for HP blades and another image for Cisco blades. So you need a way to differentiate which image you assign to those. So you may do it by vendor, one Cisco, one HP, whatever. Just figure out what you want to use. You'll create a vCenter folder or cluster rule. I just mentioned kind of the rules, but that's the rule that tells it which folder or cluster to assign. Create a host profile rule with the host profile. Normally what you'll do is you'll basically build one of these without a host profile rule, bring it in, and either use an existing host profile, assign it and tweak it, or create a new one yourself, whatever, and then kind of use that as your stock file. Because what happens is when you start deploying hosts, like step 7, without a host profile, it'll come up in maintenance mode. And so what happens is you apply a host profile, and then you do your answer file. And then if you reboot the host, it'll come up and join the cluster and be a working system. But if it keeps coming up in maintenance mode, you got a problem with your host profile. Most likely you haven't updated the answer file for that host, which is all stored in part of the auto deploy system once you do it. So again, if it keeps coming up in maintenance mode, it's most likely a host profile issue. You can also configure bulk licensing. So as hosts are added into the cluster, you have to give them a license key. We don't want to do that every time. So you want to assign a default license key. And this is kind of a convoluted process. So you'll use the following steps. Connect to the vCenter system and bind the associated license manager to a variable. So these are power CLI commands. So we connect to our vCenter, give it username, password, and then we associate license manager to a variable. Basically, $license data manager equals get license data manager. Then you'll run a commandlet that retrieves the data center in which the host you want to license are located, and you'll just do host container equals get data center dash name data center name. 3, create a new license data object, and so basically you'll punch this in. It's license data equals, do that, blah blah blah. Really the thing that you have to look at is the bottom is your license key, so you'll punch in your license key right there. Basically what you're doing, you're assigning some variables and then you're assigning a license key. 4, you associate the license key's attribute object you created in 3 with the key entry object. So I know by this point your eyes are glazing over. 5, update the license data for the data center with the object. You'll do that. And then provision one or more hosts with auto-deploy and assign them to the data center or to the cluster that you assign the license data to. And 7, verify that they are properly licensed. I don't expect you to remember this. I'm not even going to show this in the lab because it's all spelled out in the documentation. So look at the vSphere documentation set under the auto-deploy and know where this is. I guess it is possible for them to ask you to configure this in the lab. I don't expect the lab exam to ask you to deploy to implement auto deploy start to finish. That's too much to ask in a 3.5-hour window with 25 other questions. But you got to look for pieces and parts that they may ask you, and this is one I guess they could. I would know where in the documentation to look for this. I don't expect you to remember all this stuff. It's spelled out just like this in the documentation. But just know that to configure bulk licensing, it's a bunch of steps. Nothing hard. I mean, they literally give you the lines right here to type in. The only thing you have to think up is your data center name, maybe cluster name, and your license key. But just know where to find that in the documentation. It's very complicated. Like I just said, I recommend you just know where it is. So creating auto-deploy rules. Auto-deploy rules dictate which host will be assigned certain images. So can be matched by using many different attributes. Like I said, you can do like vendor, serial number, model number, most likely IP address. One rule must match or it doesn't work. First, decide which image profile you want to use, created using the Image Builder CLI, and you can get a list of your images using get ESXi image profile. Next, create a rule matching host to the image. So, in this one, we're going to use the IP. So, new deploy rule, dash name, the name of your rule, dash item, the name of your ESXi image. And I just called that one Nash profile. And then pattern, which is how we match a host to this rule, which is in quotes, IP version 4 equals and a range of IP addresses. You can use commas and do individual IPs. You can do kind of all sorts of things, but I just do a range. Then you activate the rule by using add deploy rule and the rule name. And then you can add other rules like a rule to add the host to a cluster, list the clusters using get cluster, and create another rule. Again, it's the same exact format, just a different name and a different item. This time the item is not an image, it's the name of my cluster, which is Cybertron. And again, you activate the rule. You can also do a host profile rule. We'll do this in the lab. Basically, you're going to do the same new deploy rule, dash name, give it a name, dash item is the host profile name, and then the pattern. I'll also show you, again in the lab, you can combine all three of these. So if you wanted to, you can do new deploy rule, dash name, whatever, dash item, and do it in order. So it would be, let's see, this one is the cluster, the first one is the image. So it would be image, comma, cluster, comma, host profile. So it's, dash item space, Nash underscore image, comma, Cybertron, comma, Nash lab profile. And it's just the name of the item with commas in between. I normally do individual rules like I've spelled out here because you can change them individually, and if you have different compute elements that need different things or different clusters or different profiles, you can split those out. But you can, again, kind of combine these into one rule. So once you do this, the process is basically automatic. Server should be set to PXE boot. Server boots and gets an IP from the DHCP server along with the TFTP server address and name of the gPXE boot file. That's your option 66 and 67. Then the server pulls the gPXE boot file from the TFTP server, and the file provides host what it needs to boot and talk to auto-deploy. So that file is not your image. It's kind of a pre-boot environment that lets it then connect to auto-deploy. If you don't do your claim rules correctly, you will get a boot image or a message on the screen that basically says there's no assigned image to you. You need to set up claim rules. So if you get that, it means your claim rules are either not existent, or the pattern isn't correct and it's not matching, or you never actually added the rules to an activated rule set. So we'll show you that in the lab. Auto-deploy server compares information from the server with its rule set. If it matches, it selects the right image profile. Then it pulls the image into memory and boots. It's best to use a host profile for configuring auto-deployed hosts. If you don't, they come into the cluster in maintenance mode, then you manually have to do it, so use your host profiles. Steps for creating a rule for applied host profile. This is the one I mentioned a minute ago. List the host profiles using get VM host profile, and then you create a rule against the same rule, new deploy rule, name, item, and the pattern. Assign the rule by putting it in the active rule set, which is just add deploy rule. So again, it's simple. 3 different claim rules. Just remember that. I think claim rules are an awesome exam question because, again, it's things that can be checked, it's configured, and it's something that you'll need to know how to do, and it's a really repeatable process. So definitely know how to do your claim rules. So now we're going to do a lab. So we'll look at the components, configure PXE, create the necessary rules, and test a server deployment. I'm going to do it in my lab the way you can probably do it in your lab if you have a lab. Basically, I'm going to create nested ESXi hosts. I'm running them underneath another physical ESXi host. Benefit of this is I don't have to touch my physical hosts. I can make changes. VMs do support PXE boot, and that's what they'll do if there's nothing to boot off of. And basically, I just created a shell of a VM. I don't even have a hard disk in it. and we're just going to do it all right there. So with that, let's go ahead and jump over to the lab. So here we are over in the lab. So a few things I want to show you. First of all, I've already got auto deploy installed. The installation is very simple. If you run auto run off your vCenter file collection of files, it's just auto deploy. And the reason I walk you through it, it looks like every other vCenter add-on, like we did syslog collector, like we did dump collector. It's basically next, next, next. Take the default ports, give it the login and the IP to vCenter so it can install a plugin, and you're done. And once you're in and done, just make sure that your plugins are there, auto deploy is enabled, and you see the icon under administration here. And so what it shows you is a couple of things. First of all, if you can't remember what you plug into your option in DHCP, there's the boot file name. It shows you your boot URL, cache space and use, and here's where we download the TFTP boot file. So you click that and you can download it, and you put it in the root directory. So I see I have a directory called TFTP root. Here's the zip file, and here's what it looks like when you expand it. And here's the file that the system actually requests when it starts to boot, and then it grabs a bunch of other stuff. So just put it in TFTP root, unzip it, and you're good to go. The TFTP server I use is just SolarWinds. It works great. Install it, configure it, and just set your root directory. That's the default. Make sure you start it. Let's see, is there anything else you need to do? I don't think so. Yeah, just bind all, and you're good to go. Under security, make sure you can send and receive files. I guess really all you got to do is send files and allow all IPs, or limit it if you want to. But this is a good free TFTP server. Let's see. So we do that, and then let's see. So that's all of our components. I'll assume you've already got PowerCLI installed. I have that here. And so the first thing we're going to need to do is add an ESXi image depot. So add ESX software depot. That's it. Z update. And that's the ESX image that I downloaded, so we have it. And if you want to see them, it gets ESXi image profile. And that shows all of them. Let me limit that to the name. So my suggestion is you create your own. You don't have to, but if you remember. Image profile, let's see. New profile, clone profile. So I want to clone one of these. I'll do standard, and I'll do the latest. Give it my name, which is Nash_profile, and then I need to do a vendor, which I'll just put as Nash Corp. And there we go. So now we have mine. And then we just want to start doing some rules. So we do a, let's see, a new deploy rule. Let's see, name. And we'll call this one image rule item. And the name of it is Nash profile. Actually, I don't know why I called that Nash profile, because it's an image. It's not a host profile. Oh well. Oops, I forgot my pattern. It'll prompt you, but I want to show you how to the right way to do this. So it's IP version 4, and here is my range. You don't have to do the whole network. I just do because I've used DHCP, so it is what it is. Oops. Let's see. You're not. Oh. All this time, and I forgot to connect to vCenter. VI server. You got to do that because it's got to talk to the auto deploy service. So make sure you connect to your vCenter. It'll give you a big certificate warning. All right, now we're connected to vCenter. So new image, new deploy rule. Give it the name, give it the item, and give it the pattern. And there we go. So we got the first one. Now we need to make it active. So we do add deploy rule and just give it the name. Simple as that. Next, we want to create a cluster rule. So if you can't remember what your clusters are, just do get cluster. And there's my two clusters. So we will do new deploy rule dash name cluster rule dash item, and the name of it is auto deploy. I created a separate cluster for this. And again, you have to do a pattern because you may want different things to show up in different clusters. Okay, then we add it. And I'll go ahead and do the profile rule, so that's pretty simple as well. If you want to get a list of your profiles, get VM host profile, and then we do yet another new deploy rule. Give it a name, assign profile, then we do dash item. And remember, you could combine all these and just say, Nash Lab all in one rule, and just do dash item and be like image name, cluster name, profile name, and just pick the right name. So it'd be like, Nash profile, cluster was auto deploy, and profile name is going to be lab host profile. So you can actually do that. Again, I just kind of like to split them out. And again, give it a pattern. Again, the pattern can be a lot of different things. So I didn't really get into all this, but you can do patterns for vendors. So you can do, dash pattern, quote, vendor equals, model equals, serial. It's serial for serial number. You can do asset tag with asset. You can do the bootnik if you want one rule per host and mapped by your MAC address. You can do it by MAC, do it by domain name, do it by host name, and it will take your IP and reverse resolve it in DNS to the host name and do that. There's a lot of ways to do this, but the ones I find the most common are IP addresses, just because, I don't know, they're simple and not an issue. All right, so now we have our three rules: image rule, cluster rule, assign profile. Pretty simple stuff here. And really, you can put rules that match multiple things, and you got to get the order. So it'll do things like, I don't know, if you want to insert a rule, you can do that. You can also, instead of doing, this is great, I accidentally did, but I need to mention, instead of doing a pattern, you can just say dash all hosts. So if you look, I've only got Cisco UCS blades, and I know the IP they're on. You can do it by IP, or you can just do dash all host. So that's pretty handy too. Yeah, so you can say @2, and it'll put it in the second spot. So when you add a deploy rule, it's not when you create it, it's when you add it. And so up here we've got our three rules: image, cluster, and assign profile. If you wanted to add another image rule above this one, you could say @1 and assign that rule. So you can mix and match that. To disable a rule, it is, let's see, it's set deploy rules, no, deploy option, deploy rule set, and deploy rule and give it the name, and it's no activate. So you can take one of these active rule sets out of the active status using no activate. So that's how you create your rule set. So let's go back to vCenter. All right, home, our hosts and clusters. Wait for it. And I have one here called ESXi test 3. If we look at the virtual machine, it's fairly simple. Let's see. The virtual machine type is other. It's set for vSphere 64-bit. And if you notice, there's no hard drive, just 2 NICs, and that's it. 4 gig of RAM, 2 vCPUs. And what we'll do is we'll go to console, and we'll boot that machine up. So it'll start, first thing it does is do a network boot, because there's nothing else to boot from, and it'll go out and hit the Pixie server. So there it is, and it's grabbing the iPixie stuff, and off it goes. So give it a second, it'll pull down the image. And the screen, I don't know if you saw it, but there were asterisks across the top and some information. It'll give you information on the image. That is the screen you'll get if there's no image assigned. So again, if it tells you that, it'll tell you that your claim rules aren't right. The fact I'm seeing a loading VMware ESXi tells me it pulled down an image and all my rules, well, my image rule matched. So we'll see in a minute, once it boots, if it comes up and logs into the cluster. Now, when this guy comes in, I've got one here running. This is ESXi-test. It's one I did just to confirm all this, named Jetfire. The reason it shows up as Jetfire is I put the proper DNS configuration in my DNS server. So I knew what IP he was going to get. do a static DHCP reservation, and then I put in forward and reverse DNS name resolution for him. So I think he's .20. So .20 reverses Jetfire. Jetfire resolves to .20. When he joins the cluster, vCenter will actually do a reverse DNS and pull up the name. When this guy logs in, he's going to log in as an IP address, and I want to show you that on purpose because I've seen a lot of people who do this and they go, well, this is great, but all my machine names are IP addresses. Well, it's all DNS. So just make sure your reverse DNS is proper. So we're going to let this guy boot, and when he boots up, he's going to boot up in maintenance mode because we've assigned a host profile, but we haven't updated his answer file. So we need to update his answer file. Other than that, I mean, there's really, the only other gotchas I tell you is we went through the Power CLI, we went through the rule set. I cloned an image. I didn't export that image. I should have done that, but we did that in the image builder lesson. So make sure if you do a change of an image or do anything custom, export it back out. You may need to do a custom image if you have drivers you need to install or something like that for these Pixie booting hosts. Another thing is, I didn't get to it in a slide deck. I meant to mention this, but Virtual vCenter. That's kind of the standard for our deployments and most people's deployments, and VMware actually recommends that now. The problem is what if you do auto deploy and a virtual vCenter? Well, you can't auto deploy all your vSphere hosts if you use a virtual vCenter. Something has to be running vCenter and the auto deploy service. So if you have a physical vCenter and all that, you're fine. But if you have virtual, you need probably 2 hosts, preferably in case there's a failure. So that you always know where vCenter is running. So with a virtual vCenter, it can be tough to do auto deploy on all your hosts. So you either need to do a separate management cluster with physical boots, or a couple of your hosts in the clusters can or have to be manually installed onto local storage or boot from SAN, but you can't do those with auto deploy. So that's really the only gotcha. Anything else has to do with the complexity of the configuration. You got to install auto deploy, make sure the plugin's good, install TFTP server, grab that boot zip and unzip it into your TFTP, set your DHCP options, make sure those are right, and then do the Power CLI commands. Follow the documentation, it's not bad. Alright, he's starting to boot. What I would know for the exam, since we have time to sit here, is know how to do those claim rules for sure. Know which components need to be installed. Know where to download that boot zip file, the one we saw here. Know where it needs to go, which is in your TFTP directory. In the exam, it may not be this directory. It probably won't be. But find out where they tell you. Make sure you drop it here and unzip it. Set your claim rules. And know how to assign a host profile and do an answer file, which you should know how to do anyway from the host profile lesson and just know in general, but make sure you know how to do that. So give this a few more seconds. It'll finish booting. You'll see it actually join the cluster and then disconnect and rejoin again due to the way this works. And then we'll look at assigning the profile. There it goes. It joined the cluster, and I told you it would disconnect, and it will. So he's .22. So I would go and actually configure the correct reverse DNS and all that good stuff and give him a name. So he'll come back, and he is in maintenance mode as we expected. But it did boot, it did join. So the fact it booted showed that our claim rules are correct. The fact that he joined the cluster shows our cluster rule is correct. And if we go to host profiles, look at our lab host profile, hosts and clusters, and the fact that he's attached to this host says our host profile rule is correct. So then we just need to do our answer file. So right click, update answer file. This is a simple host profile. The only thing I set really is the management IP. You can make it as complex as you want to. I mean, that's the idea of host profiles. You should do all your config through it. So give him the IP, tell him to update. Check answer file, should show complete. Take him out of maintenance mode. And I'm going to reboot this server. And the reason I'm rebooting the server is because I want to make sure when he joins next time, he's not still in maintenance mode. That'll tell you if your answer file is correct. So give it another few minutes, and we'll wait and see what happens. All right, host is finally connecting. Let it do 100%. And it's all up and not in maintenance mode, which means our profile worked and our answer file worked. So that's it. I mean, that's host profiles. The tricky part is just putting all the pieces together. When it works very, very well. So that's it for the lab. And that's it for this lesson. So again, we already went over what I would recommend for the exam. I showed you that you can do this in your own lab. If you have a lab capable of supporting vSphere hosts, you can, create these and run them no problem. So it's a good way to test it out. I suggest you do that at least one time. If for some reason you can't do the actual booting, I would at least install PowerCLI and go through the PowerCLI commands for adding in an image and creating your rules. So that's it for the lesson. Look forward to seeing you on the next one.